Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck guide. This time is Blue Living in Modern. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these in-depth deck analyses, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below. So this may arguably be the most simplistic deck we have done so far, as it is the first true combo deck that we have covered in these deep deck dives. Some would argue that Burn might be a little bit more easier than this deck, but this deck is very simplistic in what it's trying to do in its game plan, and the key is learning how to maximize that effect. That is, you're trying to use one of your two cascade spells, Shardless Agent or Violent Outburst, to cascade into Living End. Prior to that, you are seeking to fill your graveyard with as many creatures as possible, using either evoke creatures or cycling creatures to get yourself an arbitrarily large graveyard and to cast Living End. Living End, the way it's templated, basically takes everything in your graveyard, sets them to the side, puts everything that's in play into the graveyard, and then brings those exiled creatures back into play that were originally in your graveyard. It's really kind of weird templating. It does get around one potential hate card, which is Grafdigger's Cage, because it's not actually in the graveyard when the spell is doing its resolution. But beyond that, you are playing a bunch of cycling creatures, things like Architects of Will, Curator of Mysteries, Striped Riverwinder, Waker of Waves, which, while it doesn't have cycling per se, it does have a discard. Look at the top two, and then you put an additional card in the graveyard. So while most of these are cycling mana for one, this is very powerful in what it does, and then Street Wraith obviously kind of cycles for free. And then beyond that, you are playing 4 copies of Grief in most of these lists, which is an evoke for discarding a black card, which is reasons to run Architects of Will, Street Wraith, and Living End. Beyond that, the argument of whether you should run 3 or 4 Living Ends, I've seen, I believe it was Andrea Mangucci, or either Andrea or Gabe run the 4th Living End because they didn't like to run out of Living Ends in some key spots, so that is something to consider. And one of the other new additions to the deck, as far as the creatures, is Colossal Skycurl, which allows you to return target card from your graveyard to your hand, which allows you effectively to return, say, one of your Cascade spells to your hand, so you can go again with a Living End, or maybe, return a Grief and, maybe discard something from your opponent's hand, return a Force of Negation to your hand, etc. Or allows you to return target creature to its owner's hand. See if your opponent has a Meddling Mage or something keeping you from doing what you need to do. This is a very powerful effect to have access to as a 1 over 2 of. Other things that this deck has gained access to is Otawaro as a way to bounce creatures, artifacts, or enchantments, or planeswalkers to its hand. This answers a lot of the hate cards against the deck, which we'll talk about in a bit when we're talking about the sideboard cards, but it is a rather nice way to fit into your mana base. And then, basically beyond that, you're playing a bunch of lands to support your 3-color deck, other than some of these black versions do play 1 copy of Sunken Ruins, which by itself enables you to cast Grief and Street Wraith, and when you have to go to your backup plan, which oftentimes is hard casting your creatures. Endurance is kind of one of the flex slots in this deck. This is kind of the anti-mirror match thing, while also being good against Is It Murktide and a few other decks. One of the strategies players can employ against the Living End deck is getting creatures in their own graveyard if they have someone to do so, whether they're a Reanimator deck themselves or just their creatures dying in random different ways, etc. Endurance can be a way to kind of force them to not get anything back whenever you're doing that, and then you use Force of Negation to either protect your creatures once they're resolved, or if you go cast an instant Violent Outburst, you can use Force of Negation to protect your Living End and actually letting it resolve. Sideboarding, this is where things get a little bit tricky, as this is very much a one-trick pony deck. It is very reliant on its graveyard to do what it needs to do, so you have to determine what kind of hate are you likely to come up against. Are you likely to come up against hate in the form of counterspells? Are you likely to come up in the form of hate against things like Endurance and such? Or are you likely to encounter actual hate pieces like Rest in Peace, Relic of Progenitus, or the various different artifact ones that you'll see out of the Urza's Saga decks? Leyline of the Void, also in their hate card, you will see. So that kind of plays into what kind of things you're going to bring in. Foundation Breaker and Force of Vigor here are primarily for the permanent based hate pieces that aren't creatures. So whether you're expecting Rest of Peace, Relic of Progenitus, Tormod's Crypt, Lantern, I forget what the name of the exact card is, but you have a bunch of different artifact based hate or enchantment based hate. These kind of come and answer those. Subtlety also allows you to answer planeswalker based hate, such as Teferi Time Raveler, or creature based hate, such as countering an endurance at a key point in time, keeping your opponent from exiling or shuffling your graveyard back in, or exiling it in certain regards. And then you also have to face the hate pieces that come in because of the Cascade mechanic itself. So whether that be Void Mirror or Chalice of the Void, those are also additional things you have to consider as to what my opponent's hate piece of choice is going to be against us. Leyline of Sanctity kind of serves as a twofold thing. Number one, it's great against things like Endurance and Relic of Progenitus. While it doesn't stop the activation of Relic, it does keep your opponent from being able to target you with Relic, so they constantly have to leave that 1 mana up. Mostly against Endurance, and it's also against things like discard spells to a certain extent, although this deck tends to play very well against discard with all the cycling. Or you can also bring it in against a deck like Burn, which has historically been a difficult matchup for this style of deck. Also, you have Brazen Borrowers, which allow you to be a catch-all against any permanent that you need to answer. Then Mystical Disputes help you fight up against counter spells, as even a spell like Remand can really screw with what you're doing, as you're really not equipped to cast Living End, as the Suspend 3 makes it really prohibitive, and you're not really casting the card, as you really don't have any black mana in your deck other than Sunken Ruins. So a lot of the skill of this deck comes down to game one. Fairly easy, simplistic in executing its game plan. Very good against creature-based decks. It's okay against combo because you do tend to have a fast clock and you have some disruption in the form of Grief and Force of Negation, as well as any types of, if you're running any type of subtleties in the main deck, etc. But it does tend to be weak against heavy counterspell decks and can be weak against any deck that's packing main deck hate pieces because it doesn't have a lot of outs in those situations. Mainly you have Otawara and Sky Turtle, and we'll see in other builds of the deck. There are some other things you'll see in the anti-hate thing. Brazen Borrower is also a card that from time to time has ended up in the main deck of these cards as an out to these hate pieces in the main deck. Basically, game number one, it's all about executing your game plan, trying to put a large board presence in play, kill your opponent quickly. It's very good against the creature-based decks. It's okay against the combo because you have Force of Negation and Grief, and kind of struggles against the control decks that are really able to counterspell. So decks like Is It Murktide can be very much a struggle in game number one. And then as far as your sideboarding, it depends on what you're expecting to fight against. If you're expecting to fight against permanent-based hate, you're going to board out some amount of your cyclers and bring in some amount of your answers, whether it's Force of Vigor or Foundation Breaker. If you're playing against a heavy creature deck, a deck like Hammer Time, or a deck like Old Death and Taxes style decks, maybe a deck like Humans when those pop up from time to time, you might board out your Force of Negations, as there really aren't a lot of targets in that. Then another card you can often find yourself boarding out sometimes is Grief, as it can be a little bit awkward in some spots. Maybe you'll shave on those. Otherwise, you might be doing your couple of your Striped Widowwinders, etc. Or, boarding out Endurances if you're not facing against a graveyard-based deck. A lot of different things you can do, but basically you're shaving numbers and you're trying to constantly execute that game plan of cascading into Living End. As far as other builds of the deck, this one's a little bit unique as it does not have access to Grief in the main deck, which does make it a little bit more weak against trying to disrupt the counterspell-based decks, although instead it's trying to run Subtlety and Windcaller Aven, so you're not running any type of Architects of Will, and you're primarily relying on counterspells and Subtlety to get you through, but you also don't have to worry about running that Sunken Ruins to facilitate the thing. And then, as far as additional spells, you're running one Valakut Awakening in this build as a way to, bottom some cards while also being another red source. And then, instead of running 2 copies of Otawara, then running 1 Otawara and 2 copies of Beseju, which once again is another answer to a lot of the hate pieces you're going to see, whether it's, the anti-cascading cards with like Void Mirror and Chalice, whether it's going to be the various graveyard hate pieces. This kind of gives you a lot of answers in that regard, and being a little bit cheaper to activate than your Otawaro is here. And then, beyond that, only one of Endurance in the main deck. Otherwise, a lot of the things, although Windcolor Raven, you can cycle it to give a creature flying out of nowhere. And then Curator of Mysteries, one card I forgot to mention is when this is in play. When you cycle or discard another card, scry one, give you a little bit of selection trying to find. Architects of Will, whenever it comes to play, allows you to stack the top of a player's deck, whether it be yours or your opponent's. Most often you're going to choose your opponent's, especially if you've had some way like bringing back a Grief and Architects of Will, stack it so you can check their hands, see what their thing is, and then try to set up the next turn to kill them. There's some interesting sideboard cards in this version as well. You're seeing one copy of Ingot Chewer to supplement the Foundation Breakers and Force of Vigors. This is a card that can come in, pop a relic for one, and you can stack the Evoke trigger to where it goes to the graveyard after it blows up the thing, and then runs a couple copies of Dead Gone, which I find interesting. This allows you to answer annoying things like Ragavan on one, and since the split cards are technically 3 mana, you don't run into the Cascade rule. Well, this isn't the most powerful sideboard card. There are some spots where maybe you'll want to deal with this, or a Thalia, or Pure Steel Paladin, something early in the game before your game plan really gets going, as you generally are pretty well set up against the Hammer Time-esque decks and such. One thing this deck does is it plays copies of Leyline the Void as additional graveyard hate to pair with its Endurances. This kind of allows you to play, a turn 0 way to guarantee your opponent's not going to get stuff in their graveyard. And we've already kind of talked about the role Leyline of Sanctity plays in the deck. This one's choosing to play a couple Mystical Disputes to pair with its Subtleties and Force of Negations. And one key card you cannot let get into play, if at all possible, is a copy of Teferi Time Raveler. While a lot of other things you can kind of work around, by forcing your opponent to pop a relic or forcing your opponent to, digging until you hit a hate piece. If a Teferi gets into play, you're really in some trouble because you basically have any Brazen Borrowers, or you have to hard cast creatures and start trying to attack, which is kind of your backup game plan. So that is a card that can definitely mess with you, and you really can't afford to let that resolve. Hence why you're seeing so many copies of Mystical Disputes, Subtleties, Force of Negations. It's a card you can absolutely not let resolve if you want your Cascade game plan to work. And finally, as we take a look at this version of the deck, not a lot special about this one, although there is 2 copies of Otawaro. You have 1 basic forest, 1 basic island, which can be irrelevant to play around things like Blood Moon. Some versions of this deck have run Blood Moon in the past, although it's not particularly the best tool right now for them right now. Main deck, we've seen all these different cards. There is one of Brazen Borrower in this main deck, which pairs with your Otawaros and give you outs to things like Teferi or any hate cards your opponent might be running in the main deck, specifically if they're in Urza's Saga deck, or if they're a Karn deck, and many different ways that decks in the main deck can have access to hate cards. This does give you some access to those. And then a couple copies of Colossal Sky Turtle to bounce any problematic creatures. And then sideboard, 20th land, you can grab a Boseiju, maybe over the basic forest if you're expecting, or if you're fine going up to 20 lands. And then you're seeing a lot of the same hate cards. Foundation Breaker obviously has its evoke cost. Force of Vigor allows you to hard cast it or evoke it, I guess you could say, if during your opponent's turn to blow up 2 permanent hate pieces. And beyond that, 4 copies of Subtlety when you really don't want to lose to any type of blue-based hate, especially, things like Teferi Time Raveler, whether, slowing down a Murktide Regent, etc., and obviously you don't mind having cards go into your graveyard as you want to play out of your graveyard in most situations. Now, how to play the deck, how to beat the deck. Game 1, so we've already kind of alluded to, you keep most hands that are functional at all. As long as they have 1 land, you can cycle some stuff. You're usually pretty well set up. Ideally, you're looking for a Cascader by turn 3 or turn 4. Then you get to set up a situation where you have a bunch of power in your graveyard. You say Violent Outburst on the end of their 3rd turn, bring back like 12 power, attack them, and then Shardless Agent to set up for the win. Another thing you can do is Violent Outburst can pump your creatures without casting the Cascade spell to kind of close out the game a little bit. But, game one's usually pretty straightforward. Sometimes you might have to live again, set up an even bigger board, win from there, especially if your opponent is capable of getting stuff in the graveyard. Or if you're fighting against counterspells game one, you might have to set up a Violent Outburst with Force of Negation backup, or a Violent Outburst into Shardless Agent during your next turn to resolve it. Kind of a fight away around. Then it just becomes a matter of understanding what hate pieces your opponent's going to bring in and try to fighting around that way. Your backup game plan, which these versions aren't particularly well set up for, but some of the ones that I've seen have utilized multiple copies of Brazen Embargo or an Endurance, especially in the post-board games, and then maybe whatever copies of Subtlety and Curator of Mysteries kind of play this bad tempo game plan, very similar to the backup plan that the Temur Cascade, Temur Rhinos deck employs whenever its primary game plan is shut down. That said, its primary game plan is a lot stronger than the Temur Cascade Rhinos deck, but it is a lot more susceptible to more forms of hate, as not only do you have to face the anti-Cascade cards, Teferi, Chalice, Void Mirror, etc., you're also fighting through the anti-graveyard hate cards, Leyline the Void, Rest in Peace, Tormod's Crypt, Relic of Progenitus, etc., whatever various different artifact hate pieces people will run. So, that is something to consider as you're fighting through those things, is what types of hate pieces is my opponent likely to run, and kind of board that way. Once again, the cards you're most likely going to be boarding out, Force of Negation against creature-based decks, or, something where there's not like a ton of things. Other things you're going to, are weak cyclers like Architects of Will, maybe start Winterwander, maybe a couple copies of Grief if you're cycling down Architects of Will, maybe Street Wraith if you're expecting to be against like Burn and you can't really afford to lose the life. There's a lot of situations where you have to consider what's the worst creature in my deck. If you're running some copies of Endurance in the main deck, maybe you board some of those out if like you're up against a pure control deck. This deck is very powerful. It is a tier 1 deck for a reason. It's fairly simplistic to play. It's very quick to play through leagues. It's one of those decks that you can just jam. There's very simplistic in what it's trying to do. So it's not always the most interesting deck to play, but it is definitely a tier 1 deck. It's probably the better of the two primary Cascade decks right now, but this is a tier 1 deck in Modern, and something you should be aware of. Figure we discussed that. And then, as far as decks it's good against the creature decks, okay against combo. It struggles against anything blue with ton of counter spells, although it can obviously set up situations where it can win. And then, the other key of the deck is learning to play with the graveyard hate that your opponent might be bringing in, learning to play around that. Or if you are playing against this deck, it's learning how to play against the, learning when their key turns are, learning when they might be setting a Violent Outburst and when they just might be, just cycling a few creatures at the end of turn. It's really kind of hard to say sometimes when to pull the trigger. And then, obviously, one of the other game plans you can do, if you're something like a Reanimator deck or a Hardened Skills deck with Arcbound Ravager, potentially you can get a bunch of stuff into the graveyard and make it unprofitable. Or you can evoke elementals, put them in the graveyard in response to your opponent doing stuff. Then all of a sudden you're coming back with just as big a board as they have, and kind of screws with their whole plan. But that's the primary way to play the deck, what you're playing with and playing around, as both playing with the deck and as the opponent. So, I figured to give you a quick rundown of the deck, what cards you might see. One other card you might see is Titanius Rex, which is just another cycler that I believe gives a trample counter whenever it's cycled. There might be a few other cyclers you might see. And the other thing is, this deck is kind of the spiritual successor to two different decks. That is the old Jund Living In deck, which was more about Dread. What was the name of the card? Demonic Dread and Violent Outburst. It would play, obviously, those color creatures more over the blue ones. And then you had the blue Living In decks, which were like Electro Dominance, As Foretold decks. And then finally, with the printing of Shardless Agent, the amalgamation of the two decks combined became this kind of colossal behemoth that you've seen. That gets to play, Force of Negation, Grief, etc. So, very powerful deck overall. Something you need to be aware of in the format. And as always, if you do like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving it a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below.